Welcome to World Chess Championship game number 10. We have Ding Liren with the white pieces. The score is currently tied, and Ding starts with d4. We have knight to f6, knight to f3, pawn to d5, and bishop to f4, the London system, which Ding got a slight advantage in a previous game, which ended up in a draw. After pawn to e6, we have pawn to e3, pawn to c5, bishop to e2, bishop to d6, and now Ding takes on c5, changing the character of the pawn structure. Ding likes to play slow, strategic chess with the opportunities to play for risk-free tactical play ideally. And I'm seeing a theme of his opening style of play. If we take a look, for example, at game number 4, Ding with the white pieces plays for this very slow setup with knight f3, bishop e2, in this case a nice idea with bishop to a3, and he's trying to aim for a small strategic edge with tactical possibilities and risk-free play. If we take a look at game number 6, for example, actually this was the other game with the London. If we take a look at game 8, we see a position where, again, super solid setup for white. And the problem with this is, if we go back to our game, there's no real pressure on black. You're changing the position with the move takes on c5, takes on c5, but there's not enough pressure on Gukesh, and he's been holding with the black pieces extremely well. So in order to combat Ding's opening, black just needs to take control over the center, develop pieces, and castle. There's no real pressure on black to make critical decisions, and in order for Ding to beat Gukesh, this might need to change. He might need to try an opening as white where he's not playing as if he has the black pieces up a tempo. After pawn to c4, we have castles, castles, knight to c6, knight to c3, and pawn takes on c4, by Gukesh trying to go for some trades. After bishop takes, we have again a completely symmetrical pawn structure. 4 versus 4 on the king side and 2 versus 2 on the queen side. We have knight to h5, and Gukesh wants to liquidate the position and win the bishop pair. The biggest problem for black in this position is the development of the light-squared bishop, and from white's perspective, he has two strategic edges in the position. The first one is the extra development tempo that white has at the start of the game, and this light-squared bishop. So here Ding plays the move bishop g5, keeping the bishop, but failing to take an opportunity to change the character of the game and play for a specific advantage. Bishop g5, although it hits the queen, black can trade the queens and play knight f6. Black can play bishop to e7. This one move threat is not going to put any real pressure on Gukesh to solve concrete or strategic problems here. He played bishop e7 as Gukesh, but there was an idea that he could have played with white to get some imbalance, and I think this could have put a lot of pressure on Gukesh to solve strategic and concrete problems, and he could have played the move knight to e4 here. The point is that the bishop on c5 is hanging, so after the capture on f4, pawn takes back, bishop to e7, we can play queen to e2, queen to b6, for example, trying to develop the light squared bishop, and it seems like this move is completely fine. It looks like black is just going to develop, but there can be some really big problems. For example, after rook to c1, bishop to b7, rook to d1, attacking the queen, and queen c7, we have the move bishop to b5, putting pressure on the knight. White is still using his advantage of that one tempo in development, and black's loss of time trying to develop this bishop gives white a nice advantage and the potential for some serious tactical play as well. So he didn't go for this, and instead he went for bishop g5. Very safe approach, but the problem is you're not really putting too much pressure on black. After bishop to e7, we have knight to e4, knight to f6, Knight takes, bishop takes, queen takes, rook takes, bishop takes, and pawn takes. So Ding trades into an endgame where black has a slight weakness. The doubled pawns on the f-file and arguably the h7 pawn. The problem with this statement in general is that although the pawn structure is weakened, there's no way for white to actually take advantage of this. If we take a look at the knight on f3, it's unable to use the g5, e5, or d4 squares. This may be a problem if white were able to attack these pawns in some way, or there was some imbalance in terms of the pawn structure, like white had 4 pawns and black only had these 3 pawns. Or we had 3 pawns and black, let's say, was just left with these 2 pawns. So although on appearance, black is having some structural weaknesses, if there's no way for white to take advantage of this, either by attacking these pawns directly or trying to get a passed pawn, then it's not a big enough weakness to win the game. We have rook to d1, bishop d7, rook to c1, bishop to e8, rook takes, king to f1, king g7, both sides now bringing the kings into the endgame, pawn to a3, pawn to f5, king e1, king f6, bishop e2, and knight to e7, which is a fantastic move. Gukesh is aiming to either trade the rooks on the c8 square or take over the c-file if white declines the trade, or play a move like bishop c6, activating the bishop, or a move like knight e5. The bishop on e8 will finally be able to get in the game, and there's no way for white to infiltrate. Ding played the move g3. If you try a move like rook c7, we can simply block with rook to d7, and the c8 square is covered by the knight. We have pawn g3. Now Ding starts to put all of his pawns on dark squares, hoping to reach an endgame where we're left with 2 bishops on the board. We have rook to c8, takes, knight d2, knight d6, knight d4, takes. So we have an endgame where black has some pawns on light squares. All of white's pawns are on dark squares, which means the light squared bishop cannot attack anything, and maybe white can get an edge here. After bishop c6, we have pawn to f4, pawn to b6. Now Gukesh also putting his pawns on dark squares, and king to d2. So how exactly is white supposed to win this? The e4 square is covered, so we can't get the pawn break in with e4. And if we did get this pawn break in with e4, for example, with bishop d3 and e4, but just potentially, then after this trade, we have 3 versus 3 on the king side, which is still a drawn position. So we should think about maybe playing the move g4 to activate the bishop and get this pawn, and maybe our h-pawn will win the game. But what if black puts the pawn on the dark squares as well? And it seems like in this position, there's really no clear way for white to get any sort of advantage. We have king to e7, king to c3, king to d6, and pawn to b4. Now Gukesh puts the pawn on f6 on a dark square, and king to d4, and pawn to h6. So imagine you had the white pieces here. How do you make progress? The king can never infiltrate. You can't play a4. If you bring the bishop back to play a4, and if you ever play the move a5, Gukesh is not obliged to take. He can just sit and wait, and after this capture, the king can still not invade. If you trade off the bishops, then the pawn structure is definitely weaker for black, but black is not obliged to trade bishops. There's no way to force a trade in this position. If the king tries to run to the other side of the board, bishop to e8 can stop the king from moving forwards. So maybe you could try for some remaneuvering of the king all the way to the other side of the board. And the problem with that is that with all the time that it takes to do that, maybe black will be able to bring their king in. And for example, after this trade, white I don't think should take, but after the trade, for example, then black's king can get into the game. So there's really nothing concrete that white can do to push his edge further for the win. There's nothing strategically he can do realistically to push his edge further for the win. And after bishop to b3, bishop to b7, we have a repetition of moves and the game ends in a draw. Now, some people may find this game boring, and from one perspective, they're absolutely right. We'd love to see Ding try to push a lot more, try to have a forcing variation like he did in game 6 in the London, where we had this idea of queen a3 and kind of a really complicated position where it was a lot of forcing variations. But what we get is something very slow, very unforced, and not in the same way that we had in the previous games, where it was unforced, but it was very imbalanced. Ding was able to get an edge because the piece placements and the pawn structure were asymmetrical. They were very different. In this game, we have a symmetrical structure, and the only real problem was the development of the slight squared bishop, which Gukesh was able to solve and then go on to draw the game. So I find this personally interesting because it's a telling sign of how Ding plays in the opening part of the game. And if he's um, unable to get some imbalance, then he is satisfied with just a slight, very slight edge and is satisfied with a draw. From Gukesh's perspective, he is holding extremely well with the black pieces. He hasn't lost a single game as black, and the only real problems he had was in one of the games. He was the one trying to push for a win because he misjudged his position as losing. He was still trying to push for the win, and in that case, his position got worse. So it seems like it's up to Gukesh to come up with something. It seems like it's up to Gukesh to try to push for a win and maybe make an unforced error and lose the game in the process, or go for glory and win the game. Gukesh has the white pieces in the 11th round, which is coming next, and I look forward to seeing how Gukesh plays. I hope he plays e4 with the white pieces, trying to get an edge against Ding Liren's French defense. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you in the next one.